Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at the indigenous peoples, or many of the indigenous peoples around the world, and focus on Nicaragua in particular, to look at what they're doing as far as promoting biodiversity, combating climate change, and really helping to preserve planet Earth. My guest today is an expert on all these issues. My guest today is Dr. Myrna Cunningham Kain. Dr. Myrna Cunningham Kain is an indigenous Miskita woman in Nicaragua. Dr. Kain is a former chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Dr. Myrna Cunningham Kain, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about Nicaragua and the Miskita people in Nicaragua. You know, we are celebrating almost 30 years of autonomy. 30 years ago, the Nicaraguan state accepted that regime of self-government, respecting indigenous collective rights and the establishment of autonomous regions in almost 50% of the Nicaraguan territory.
Is that right? 50%? Well, that's a good lead-in. Thank you for paving the way. You're with the Miskita, and before the show you told me there were 10 indigenous groups in Nicaragua. Where are they, and roughly how large are they? Not each one, but just roughly.
Most of the the indigenous lives on these two autonomous regions on the east coast of Nicaragua. The Miskitos, the Mayangnas, different 4 groups of indigenous Mayangnas, the Ramas, and on the Pacific and the center of Nicaragua, there are also indigenous groups that live in 9 of the Nicaraguan departments.
Now, when I think of indigenous peoples, I think of the original natives of an area, like the Maoris of New Zealand, the Native Americans from North America or whatever, or the Aborigines from Australia. Is that pretty much a definition, the original inhabitants of a particular geopolitical area?
The broad definition is really related with the people that inhabited a specific area before the governments or the countries were established. So it is really the original inhabitants of a specific area that share different cultural values, share language, and have a very distinct relation with nature and with territory. We don't have at the UN a specific definition on indigenous peoples, but those are the terms that we use.
They apply in every case, probably, or most cases. Now, you're with the Waspam community. Describe the Waspam community a little bit. Just how large is it? What are some of the major activities in that community? Some of the major challenges and contributions, too, to preserving biodiversity and that type of thing.
Waspam is a small village in on the border of the Huanqui River. The Huanqui River is the one that divides Honduras and Nicaragua. So in this area, there are 115 small communities all along the river and in the savannas. These are communities that have faced a lot of problems in the past because we are living on the border. There's a lot of pressure from Honduras. We used to share the same territory, but now the border divided the indigenous peoples. But it's also communities that have a very strong relation with spiritual values. We believe in our spirits that protect the water, spirits that protect the forest. And those spiritual values are the ones that help us conserve nature, because we don't like to destroy the areas where the spirits are living. The other important aspect is that we have a very strong governance system, traditional governance system. Each one of the communities have traditional leaders that are the ones that have the responsibility to ensure that the members of the community abide by the traditional and customary regulations. We also have traditional leaders that are the ones responsible of the administration of justice in our communities. And I would say something that is very important, we have strong group of indigenous women that are organized and are trying to develop a lot of activities to protect the river, protect the water, protect the territories, and ensure that the traditional knowledge moves from one generation to another.
Now, you've been describing the sustainable development or the sustainability of an area in particular, and it brought to mind climate change. So many of the scientists, in fact, 97% of the major scientists in the world believe that climate change is the #1 problem we're confronting. Is this a major problem for your community and many of the other indigenous communities in Nicaragua? And also, have you noticed that adverse conditions are developing due to climate change?
Yes, climate change is a big problem, especially because we live along the river or the ocean, and the other communities in the Pacific live in very dry area. So on one side, we have communities that get flooded every year and lose their agricultural production, and communities that cannot plant because of the dryness and the drought. So climate change is a main concern of indigenous peoples in our region. And because of that, our autonomous government have developed a strategy to confront climate change, a strategy that has been defined together with the indigenous communities and has been adopted by the local, the community and the territorial governments. So climate change also try to focus on 3 areas. We do try to build resilience in our communities. We try to promote adaptation. We are trying to define how to influence when there are mitigation measures being considered by the Nicaraguan government. And at the same time, we include a lot of aspects that are related with disaster, because we live in a region that is exposed to a lot of disasters because of climate change.
What types of activities are underway in Nicaragua right now to help? Now, Nicaragua can't defeat climate change by itself, but we all have to do it together. Are there programs underway right now to preserve biodiversity, to try to mitigate some of the harsh consequences of climate change?
There's 2 types of activities. One is related with the communities that lives in the area that is exposed to drought, because this is a Central American problem. There are a lot of communities in this area, and they are trying to promote different activities to confront that. On the other side, in the region the area where I live, there's a program a readiness proposal to try to analyze how to reduce the emission of carbon, in how to use our forests, how to include communities to begin to value the forest, how to reduce deforestation and degradation. So these are the 2 areas that are being discussed at this moment in Nicaragua.
And the latest statistics I saw were that indigenous peoples make up 5% of the population of the earth. They're living in 22% of the area, not that they're covering all 22, but they're in 22% of the earth's surface. And they also have 85% of all the biodiversity within the areas where they're living. This is a tremendous contribution that you're making, and a tremendous challenge to make sure that we preserve it, is it not?
Yes, for indigenous peoples, we have been saying and we have been advocating that we have biodiversity and we have conservation area because we have been the ones that have protected those areas and we have conserved them. And at the same time, we are saying that those things cannot change. We cannot change the situation if you do not involve indigenous people. So we have been advocating very hard in all of the different negotiations related with climate change, with biodiversity. We have seen some advances, but we still believe that it's important to recognize not only traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, but also all of the efforts that we have been practicing traditionally to maintain. And we want to share that with the rest of the society.
We learn from one another. It's very important.
Yes, because the problems are so big, not one group alone will solve the problem. We have to work together and we have to understand that we are connected.
That's very true, we are. And it's mandatory, absolutely obligatory that we work together on these.
Yes, yes.
Now, in your community, is it fair to say that the largest activities as far as revenue producing would be perhaps agriculture and perhaps some type of textile industry or something, or artisanship, or
no, in my communities it's still fishing.
Still fishing.
Fishing, mining. There's a lot of mining, artisanal mining also in the communities. So fishing, mining, and agriculture is for the subsistence economy in the villages. We don't have too much artisanal like other indigenous communities in our region. We are still very related with forest and with water.
And that would probably vary from community to community, I guess.
Yes.
I was thinking of Guatemala, Chichen Itza, that area, and some of the others. So
yeah, you can see.
That's right.
This is Guatemala.
That's
this is Guatemala, and we have the indigenous women in all of our communities are so. They have so much knowledge because they can produce a lot of this type of art. Yeah.
Well, now you mentioned mining and fishing, and we were talking about climate change as being probably the #1 challenge. What are one or two other problems you're dealing with today?
We're dealing with marketing for the products of agriculture. We live in a very isolated area on the east coast of Nicaragua that has traditionally been separated from the rest of the country. So even if we try to promote that new type of economical production in the communities, we are still isolated from the market. I would say that's a main problem for our communities. And the big other problem that we're facing is that 50% of Nicaragua territory is under the administration of the autonomous regions. 30% of Nicaragua has been recognized as collective land of indigenous peoples. So for the rest of Nicaraguans, that they are the 85% of the population, they see our region as a region that has territory, have land. So we do face a problem of of settlers coming into our region. So I would say that's another problem, that agriculture, farming, is something that can be promoted, but it has to respect the way the traditional lands of indigenous peoples.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed in Global Connections programs are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you have an interest in sharing these programs, if you're involved with a PBS station, community access television, or perhaps a university with an intra-campus hookup, or you just have a website and you would like to share the programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost. Today we're talking about indigenous peoples and some of the challenges they confront, and we're looking at one community in Nicaragua. And my guest is an expert on all of these issues. My guest today is Dr. Myrna Cunningham Kain. Dr. Myrna Cunningham Kain is an indigenous Miskita woman from Nicaragua, and she has filled just a variety of roles over the past several years in helping to focus the spotlight on indigenous issues and indigenous peoples. Before we leave, we'll move on from Nicaragua in just a moment, but you mentioned about the autonomy and the autonomous regions and how that I think 50% of the land or something like that is basically considered commons. I think land of the people, so to speak. Is that in the Constitution? Do you have some type of I guess, jurisdiction over that land? You have governmental, the various indigenous peoples have their own tribunals or that type of thing? How does that work?
Yes, we have in the Constitution recognized that Nicaragua is a multi-ethnic nation, and it recognized that in the case of the Caribbean coast, there are 2 autonomous regions. These autonomous regions are multi-ethnic, so the law established that to be elected as member of the regional parliaments of the autonomous governments, each jurisdiction have to elect persons from different ethnic groups, different indigenous peoples. So we have a multi-ethnic composition of our autonomous governments of 45 members. These 45 members elect the directive board that has to be also multi-ethnic. And the autonomy recognized, this regional autonomous government is recognized by the central government of Nicaragua. Each one of the region has also territorial governments, and these are also recognized in the Constitution in Nicaragua. Our administration of justice recognized that in our communities, the administration of justice is under the legal elected members of the communities to administrate justice. So we have a process in which we have our own model of intercultural health, intercultural bilingual education system, and we have 30 years of development of this process that we consider unique in Latin America.
It certainly sounds like it is very unique. Well, you were talking about the environment, you were talking about health, and of course I think of so many groups, non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups, what have you, United Nations agencies, the UN Environment Program, the UN World Health Organization, UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, providing assistance to people in Nicaragua and around the world in many areas. And while focusing on these folks, I was thinking also the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that's a forum at the United Nations. You're in New York this week to attend one of those meetings. What is the purpose of that meeting, and what does that forum do?
The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is a subsidiary body of ECOSOC, and it composed of 16 independent experts that comes from the 7 social-cultural regions of the world. And it meets once a year in New York. Over 2,000 participants come from different parts of the world, and we make recommendations that are included in a report prepared by the Permanent Forum, and they present it to ECOSOC. And once it's presented to ECOSOC and it's adopted, it becomes like policy for our governments and our organizations. This week we are discussing about the 10 years of the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is an important instrument because it was negotiated by member states and indigenous peoples over 20 years. And it includes what we call the basic rights of indigenous peoples from all over the world. So we are celebrating the 10th anniversary, and we are reviewing in this session of the Permanent Forum how these rights have been implemented all over the world.
And if our viewers would like more information, they can go to un.org/indigenous and get more information on that. Now the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that was adopted 10 years ago, is that
Yes.
correct? And so now you're fleshing it out. Now you have been involved in this process. What have been some of the major challenges as you've moved this forward? It looks like it's going at a pretty fast clip right now, but what have been some of the challenges along the way?
I say that one of the main challenge is that in some countries in the world, indigenous peoples are still not recognized. So of course, if they are not recognized, there are no specific policies to applied in those countries to help them implement their human rights. The other big challenge in some countries, we are recognized as indigenous peoples, but the statistics or does not include specific disaggregation of data. So it is very difficult, for example, to measure the SDGs implementation or any other type of recommendations because there's no specificity in data disaggregation. The other big problem is that indigenous peoples have collective rights recognized by the UN Declaration, the right to self-determination, the right on collective land rights. And collective land rights is still one of the big challenge for indigenous peoples in most of the world. And these collective land rights face the problem of in concessions on extractive industries or maybe industrialized agriculture, commodities, whatever. And this really create tensions in different parts of the world, tension over land rights.
Mm-hmm. That problem is in many areas of the world, as you indicated. In the United States, the Keystone XL pipeline has been a very contentious issue. We see the Dakota situation that's been in the news for the past several months. And of course, in many other countries of the world too, these are certainly challenges, and especially as there's been more of an emphasis upon drilling for oil or whatever the case might be, or going for gas, and instead of moving to alternative fuels, which would be a more efficient and a more effective and a cheaper way of doing it. But so many areas are still focusing on this. As you look at the indigenous peoples in Nicaragua and the folks that you've met at this conference, and you mentioned a minute ago the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm glad you mentioned those. Those are the 17 goals that really make up the development agenda for 2030, between 2016 and 2030, to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to promote gender equity and that type of thing, to promote sustainability. How, as you see it from the broad picture, the people from Nicaragua and the people that you've met here and indigenous peoples around the world, how can they work together to help achieve those goals? To focus on they're all important, but some are a little more important than others at various points in time.
We believe that, for example, one of the important goal is the number 2, the one that is related with agriculture, nutrition, because we consider that land right is an issue that has to be addressed under goal number 2. We also consider very important the goal related with inequality, because the reduction of poverty is something that in a lot of our countries in the last decade, it has advanced. There's a reduction of poverty, but there's still a lot of inequality. That's an important goal if we really want to change the condition of indigenous peoples in different parts of the world. We also believe that the goal of strong institution is very important because we want to build peaceful societies. And if you do not recognize diversity, you do not recognize that indigenous people's identity and specificity is very important, we will not be able to build these peaceful societies. But we do see the 17 goals as a package that has to be respected not only in rich countries and not only in poor countries. It's a universal package. And we have been advocating very much that in the country, the governments, when they come and report about the SDG implementation, they should really be careful to include something related with the way in which the SDG are really impacting the life of indigenous peoples. So that's one of the, I would say, the way in which we are trying to influence governments to include indigenous peoples in the SDGs implementation.
And the Sustainable Development Goals, as opposed to the Millennium Development Goals that ran from 2000 to 2015, are all inclusive. Everybody on planet Earth is involved. Every country of the world, every territory is involved in helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the pollution of the oceans, the air, whatever the case might be. These are items that we have to work on, problems we have to work on together, because if we don't, we're not going to be successful. And I think you and indigenous peoples around the world have certainly shown the spotlight on this and how we can work together. But Dr. Myrna Cunningham Kain, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure, thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.